Today, I am going to continue talking about cutting through spiritual materialism. And today I begin with chapter 3, which is titled The Guru. And this is a very profound chapter. It has a lot in it. I will begin here by saying that Chogyam Trungpa, the author of the book Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism, begins by saying one of the most difficult preconceptions that we as practitioners have to work with is that of the guru, how we perceive the guru. We think that we will get something, happiness, peace of mind, wisdom, whatever it is that we are seeking. And this is one of the most difficult preconceptions of all to work with. So he tells a number of stories in here, primarily about Marpa and Milarepa. So Marpa was the son of a farmer. He was dissatisfied with his life. And Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche doesn't mention this, but Marpa also had a temper. And when you see paintings of him, frequently he has kind of an angry or a wrathful look on his face. His anger did transform, by the way, but this is part of the reason why he ended up going to India to seek out a great teacher. And he was originally motivated to become rich and famous. And at that time, the ways were to become a famous lama. He mentions to become a robber. And there just weren't too many other paths open to become rich and famous if you were starting from, you might say, scratch. So anyway, Marpa decided that he would get involved in Buddhism. He studied Sanskrit, he studied Buddhism, and he was quite intelligent and learned a lot. And he was starting to develop as a person that had some renown in the local area. But he was more ambitious than that. And so he went to India to study Buddhism. And on his way through Nepal and then into India, he heard about Naropa, who was very famous at this time, perhaps one of the most famous living Buddhist practitioners. And so when he heard about Naropa, he felt that this is the teacher I have to study with. I have to study with the best. Can't just be anybody. It's also important to remember, this too wasn't touched on much in the book, that it was extremely dangerous and deadly to travel to India for Tibetans. And part of it was disease, that the climates are so different. You have the climate in Tibet, which is at a very high altitude. Almost all of Tibet is over 10,000 feet in elevation. So it's very low humidity. you could describe much of Tibet as alpine desert. It's a bit like the desert southwest United States. And this is one reason why there's so many Dharma centers, Tibetan Buddhist Dharma centers in this area, Colorado, the mountains of New Mexico, the mountains of Arizona, because it is so much like Tibet. And then India, on the other hand, they have the monsoon season where it's just rain, 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 humidity, humidity, humidity. And it was very common for Tibetans that went to India to get sick and die. Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche developed tuberculosis after coming to India, and many other Tibetan refugees also died of diseases in India that were not present in Tibet. But besides disease, there also was bandits and also wild animals. And now the difference between traveling today and traveling back then, and this was roughly, I think, about the 13th century. Today, you can have a credit card and you can just go to an ATM and get the cash you need and then make it, then use it as an offering to the guru. And if your credit card gets stolen, you just use your cell phone, you call up a number and you tell them it's been stolen, and they cancel it and they give you a new one. Whereas then, of course, Marpa had to have gold on him. Gold because it was compact and valuable. There are other things that had value back then, but you don't want to have to be taking a whole caravan of pack animals holding valuable things that you're going to offer to your guru. So it was gold, which was what he and others would travel with. And of course, this would be very easy for a bandit to find and rob the person of. And so travelers were very much obvious targets for bandits. So he looks and looks for Naropa and finds Naropa living in poverty. And he offers Naropa gold. And Naropa gives him teachings, but they're not what Marpa was looking for, although Marpa was not aware of this at the time. It wasn't until later when he's getting ready to go back to Tibet and he meets one of his traveling companions on the way to India. And the traveling companion and Marpa talk and makes Marpa realize that he has really not received any special teachings, that all of the teachings he's received are already available in Tibet, and that he really is not, doesn't have anything special to bring back. And so Marpa goes back to Naropa and asks for higher teachings, more special teachings, and Naropa says, well, I can't give them to you. And he obviously could. But he said, you have to go visit Kukuripa. That is Kukuripa. So Marpa went and found Kukuripa on an island. And on this island, it was full of female dogs. And they were all barking and snarling at Marpa. It was a very unwelcoming place. And Kukuripa spoke nonsense. It just didn't make any sense to Marpa. And Marpa had already learned Sanskrit by this time. And he probably by this time also could speak the Hindi language that was used at that time. So he wasn't getting anywhere. He would try to, you might say, make friends with the dog that was closest to him, snarling at him. And as soon as that dog would quiet down, then the others would kick up worse. And again, no matter what he said to Kukuripa, it still was nonsense. So finally, Marpa just plain gives up. He gives up taking notes. He gives up trying to receive anything of value. He just plain gave up. And at that time, then Kukuripa began to talk like a guru, began to speak and speak quite well. And the dogs quieted down. And then Marpa receives the teachings. And it is all because he just plain gave up. He surrendered. And before they parted, the instructions that Kukuripa gave Marpa are, quote, "Now you must return to Tibet and teach. It isn't enough to receive the teachings in a theoretical way. You must go through certain life experiences. Then you can come back again and study further." So he left and again met up with this traveling companion as they are traveling back to Tibet. And the traveling companion becomes very curious about the teachings he did receive and keeps asking more and more questions, and realize that now Marpa has much better teachings, rarer, more esoteric teachings than he has, and jealousy arises. And as they are being taken from one side of the river to the other on what you could call a ferry boat. But now remember, this would be a very small boat, that just a few people would be on it, and you would be rowed to the other side of the river. So while they're there in this open boat, this traveling companion becomes so jealous that he throws all of Marpa's texts and all of his teachings and his notes into the river, and they are lost. And so Marpa returns to his home in Tibet, empty-handed, you might say. And he is married at the time, by the way, and he is a farmer. So he did teach for a few years, and then he came to realize that his writings would have been no use to him, that what is of use to him are the teachings that became part of his experience, the teachings that he knew from within rather than by looking at something that was written on paper. So the teachings, he realized, had become part of him, that he didn't need books. And at that point, he became extremely interested in enlightenment, and he let go of becoming rich and famous. So he arranges for and then makes another trip to India and meets Naropa. And Naropa asks for an offering of gold before he will teach. And Marpa gives him gold that he brought with him, but not all of it. He holds back some of it for his return trip and perhaps expenses that might arise while he is in India. And of course, Naropa knows that he is holding back. So Naropa tells Marpa that you're something to the effect of, you are not giving me all your gold. You're being deceitful, you're being hypocritical, and that his deception can't buy the teachings. So Marpa gives everything to Naropa, and then Naropa, it's gold dust, by the way. It's not like an ingot of gold. He throws this gold dust into the air, and it is dispersed. And he tells Marpa that, what need have I of gold? My whole world is golden. Which, of course, completely, you might say, pulls the rug out from under Marpa, and his mind opens up. And, quote, he had to give up everything he had, not just his material possessions, but whatever he was holding back in his mind had to go. It was a continual process of opening and surrendering. So that is a direct quote from the book. And that's a story about Marpa and Naropa. And both of these are in our Mahamudra lineage supplication. So next he talks about Milarepa, that Milarepa was a peasant. He was a murderer. He killed 35 people. He caused a lot of harm to other beings in other ways. He came to Marpa. He had no money. He was miserable. And he wanted the teachings. He was very concerned about his karma ripening from killing 35 people and the other negative things that he had done that were very painful and caused a lot of suffering. So instead of demanding gold or other valuables, Marpa made him pay in his labor. He told Milarepa that if you want the teachings from me, you have to build me a stone house. And now, again, this was long before mechanization. This is taking stones one by one, carrying them to where you need them, and then putting them in place. And when he had gotten much of the first one built, Marpa came out and looked it over, acted very upset, and said, "Why did you build it here?" And Marpa of Milarepa said, "Well, you told me to build it here." And then Marpa would say something like, "Well, I must have been drunk. I don't want it here. You build it over there. And take down this house that you have built and put all the stones back to where you got them from." And this went on a number of times till the point that Milarepa had reached a feeling of hopelessness, and he even was on the verge of committing suicide. He had built a 9-story building at this point, and even that wasn't enough for Marpa. Marpa really put Milarepa through a lot, but it was to purify his negative karma. It was to purify his mind so he would be open for the teachings and so forth. But here now, Milarepa thinks that because I've built this 9-story house, that I can get the teachings. But Marpa says, "No, you have to make an offering to me." And he had nothing to offer. And so Marpa's wife felt sorry and compassion for Milarepa, and she gave him something to make an offering with, so that Milarepa could receive the empowerments and teachings. And so he made this offering to Marpa that Marpa's wife had given him. Marpa recognizes it, and then he uses his temper skillfully. This is what you would call wrath. By this time, he had conquered his anger, and now he was just using this, you might say, angry demeanor in a wrathful way to help Milarepa. And so he said that, "You're a hypocrite. You've offered me my own possessions." And displays a very angry, wrathful countenance. And it's at this point that Milarepa is ready to kill himself. But Marpa, being a realized being, at the last moment, he comes to Milarepa and tells him that now you are ready to receive the teachings. And quote, "The process of receiving the teachings depends upon the student giving something in return. Some kind of psychological surrender is necessary, a gift of some sort." And so this is what had happened, that Milarepa had totally given up. He had totally surrendered. He didn't have a physical gift to give, but he had the gift of, "I really don't have the ability to do anything about it. Please, please help me." And there was no artificial, he was not hiding anything. There was no facade that he was presenting to Marpa. He just presented himself as he was at the time, which was feeling very, very miserable and suffering deeply. So Chogyam Trungpa goes in to this in more detail. He says that this is not like a job interview or buying a car, that the credentials, there aren't any important credentials, that the guru will see through you. So this surrendering is kind of giving up your credentials, giving up your self-importance, and so forth. That we must be open with our teacher. We must, quote, be willing to give up all our preconceptions, end quote. That he talks about the guru, the term guru, and he prefers the term spiritual friend better than guru. He says it's like a mutual meeting of two minds. I will say this, that throughout the rest of the chapter, he still uses guru more than he does spiritual friend, but he's intending it to be interpreted this way, that the guru is a spiritual friend, that it's a mutual meeting of two minds. It's a two-way street. It's not a one-way street. He also points out that Marpa still paid attention to his daily mundane life as a farmer, as a father, as a husband, that he did not have to renounce everything to be a guru. He just renounced, you might say, denial, deceit, hypocrisy. He renounced putting up walls between himself and his guru, and eventually renounced putting up walls between himself and the world, and became very open. So Trungpa Rinpoche says, can you communicate actually with a person thoroughly and directly? This is a question to ask yourself about your guru, your lama, your teacher. That deception, omitting things, and so forth are huge problems, that we have to avoid this, or we're not really going to get very far. And again, here is another question that Trungpa Rinpoche has in this chapter, quote, is the guru really able to see through your masks, to communicate with you properly, directly, end quote. So think about that. This puts you in a very uncomfortable position if you have a good guru, because a good guru-student relationship is one where the guru sees through your masks. And it's a relationship where you can communicate directly, right to the point, and not beat around the bush. I remember having interviews with Rinpoche, and Rinpoche would sometimes say something like, this is trivial, or this isn't important. And that is what is being pointed out here. Are you communicating directly with the guru, or are you really talking about things that aren't all that important or pertinent? Are you putting up a facade? Are you putting a mask on? And so forth. These are always good questions to ask yourself. I heard this one time by a translator that translated for Rinpoche for interviews. And the translator said after an interview that Rinpoche mentioned to the translator that everything that the student talked about was meaningful. And so when you are with your guru, it's important to talk about meaningful things. So then he talks about the story that I mentioned in a previous talk about the friends who went to a great teacher. They were looking for a famous teacher that had a great reputation. They had this idea in their mind of this is who they wanted to have for a teacher. And this great teacher said to them, well, you can be my student, but first you have to renounce your previous teachers. And all but one of the men said, yes, they would renounce their previous teachers. And so he told them to come back the next day. And they do. And then the teacher accepts the one person that refused to renounce his previous teachers. And the point being made here is that this one was not going to play games, was not going to pretend that these other teachers never said anything worthwhile. They were not going to say things to win the guru over to their side. So again, if you want to have a fruitful relationship with the guru, your lama, then the more open you can be, the better. Then you can communicate as equals rather than feeling that you're on top of all of this. He says that there will be tests, there will be disappointments, that basically that we're dealing with our own hypocrisy in this relationship with our teacher. Quote, when this begins to wear out, our fundamental basic nakedness begins to appear, and the meeting of the two minds begins to take place. So we have to wear it out, little by little by little. It's not an all or nothing situation. And we all come with expectations, hopes, and fears, with masks and all kinds of layers of protection. So it isn't that somehow or another you are worse than other people or somehow or another better than other people, but these things all have to be worked with in order to have a proper, fruitful relationship with our teacher. The question was about the Marpa and Naropa teacher relationship, and if I had anything more to say about this. And it is that the relationship grew and developed. I think that Marpa made a total of 3 trips to India and saw Naropa on all 3 trips. And it was the third and the last one when he gave the gold to Naropa, and Naropa took it and threw it into the air, and it dispersed. And Naropa said, "I have no use for gold. My whole world is gold." And at that point, you might say the final barriers between Naropa and Marpa were removed, because before that, there still was this idea that if I give you something, I'm going to get something. And this just kind of completely, you might say blindsided, to use a modern word, Marpa, and then the barriers that he had dissolved, and the relationship became much more open. So the question is, well, Marpa, he was a householder, he was a farmer, he had children, he had a wife. How could he do all of this and feel good about it and be a good father, be a good parent, and so forth? Was he derelict in his duties, missing in action? Is this applicable to today? And so forth. And this is very important. Later on in the chapter, Trungpa Rinpoche says, and I didn't get to this point, we're getting ahead, but he says what's important is not whether you're a yogi off in a cave somewhere like Milarepa was for many, many, many years, but it's how much in touch with reality you are. That's really the core of the situation. So whether you are a householder or a yogi off by yourself, it's how realistic you are, how much in touch with reality you are, that is the important part. And I'm going to speculate here a little bit about a parent. And that is that back then, you did not have a monogamous, I shouldn't say monogamous, a parent, 2 parents and children. You had a multi-generational situation where there would be grandparents, aunts and uncles, and so forth. And so you had the extended family. And so there were more people to take care of children. Plus, if the parents are sane, and I mean free of neurosis, and he talks about sanity versus neurosis, and the Tibetans usually talk about if the male is enlightened, the wife is a dakini, meaning highly realized. So this is somewhat speculative here. But when you put these things into the equation, an extended family, a mother, a wife that is a dakini, and I promise you, if you are a farmer, the kids are kept busy. They don't have too much time to get into trouble, uh, and so forth. And so for all these reasons, it worked out. Kind of involves the present situation that, especially now where everything is on Zoom and there's not much done in person. And well, you can see on Zoom the very best of the best teachers. On the other hand, students come to this particular center and they have these expectations and they are not met. And that really goes back to why Trungpa Rinpoche wrote this book and talked about these things, which is that really from ancient Tibet, people had expectations about the guru, the ones that they were looking for and wanted to become students of. And these things had to be dealt with one way or another if a proper student-teacher relationship was to develop. So it's not new. The COVID restrictions and everything being on Zoom adds an extra, what would I say, level of difficulty to this, because it's very difficult to have that personal connection, to be in, speaking from my own experience, seeing Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche in person was a very powerful experience for me the first time and every other time. And you can't get that on Zoom. So we do what we can. And, but no matter what, these kind of stages have to be gone through. The question is that today it seems that people are in a big hurry to find a teacher. And before me, one person told a story about how they found themselves in that position, and the teacher said, the guru is within, and turned them down, and that this actually was a very insightful experience. And this is really what Trungpa Rinpoche was talking about in this whole chapter, about how the guru sees through you and keeps tearing down your expectations. Now, going into today, there's a huge spiritual, I don't know if you want to call it a fair, an exhibit, or what. Everything is out there on the internet. Everything is available, and we want to have fast food. We want to drive fast. We also want, a lot of us want light food where we can eat lots of it, but we don't gain weight. And people want light spirituality too, where you feel good, but you don't have to surrender anything. And so there's lots out there. People have lots of expectations, perhaps even more than they did in 1971 when this book was, the talks were given. And these are things that we as students need to work with ourselves. And we as people who run centers and attend centers and come in contact with new people need to try to work skillfully with new people. And it's difficult. I think almost every center, if not all centers, will say the vast majority of the new people that come after a few months or a year or so, they disappear and are never heard of again. But in a way, we have to accept their expectations, but not, you might say, give in. Khandro Rinpoche said this one time. This was her advice to people that were looking. She said, in Tibet, the tradition was that you followed a teacher for 5 years before you asked to become his or her student. In the United States, my advice is 10 years. Now, probably none of us here that are receiving his teachings waited 10 years. I certainly didn't. But we were all fortunate to have met Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche. And he was very, very skillful in working with students.